my first attempt at writing something in the spec fiction genre, having only been a fan since, being a kid and just really taking my first stab at it, but
Right,
trying also to be as authentically Anishinaabe as possible. It's an
right.
Anishinaabe
Yeah,
story and in this genre, and the Anishinaabe elements are what are the most crucial to me, right? As the storyteller, as the writer. And I really wanted to do all that respectfully. I wanted to do it honestly, and I wanted to obviously stand by all of that, and advocate for all of those things that are in it, including the language. And she was entirely hands off about all of that, and it was really, I think, empowering for me. It was my first time working with a non-Indigenous publisher. So it was really empowering to know that I had like allyship within this publisher, within the industry, because
right.
you don't know, right? When you're coming into it as someone from the so-called margins, who's on your side and who isn't,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
Susan was entirely on my side.
Hey, Rob, welcome to the Stark Reflections podcast.
Hey, Mark, thanks a lot for having me. Really excited to chat with you.
I'm honored that I have you on the podcast here. So let's before we get into, I know we're going to talk about your writing. We're going to talk about a whole bunch of different things related to publishing. Have you always wanted to be a writer? Where did that spark start for you?
I think it really started in high school for me. I really enjoyed English class, coming into grade 9, grade 10, and all that. And just the novel studies that we did, the creative writing assignments were always fun. But there was something missing for me. Like there was no real strong cultural connection or nothing entirely relatable
Right.
in the books that we read in the high school curriculum in Ontario back in the 1990s.
Yeah.
And then I was very fortunate that one of my aunts, my Auntie Elaine, showed me books by Indigenous authors who we weren't studying in the high school curriculum. People like Richard Waughemes, Lee Maracle, Louise Erdrich, and so on. And that's where it began. That's where I thought, wow, like this creative writing is something that I'm really warming up to. And now I have these points of reference where I see Indigenous people authentically writing about Indigenous experiences and communities, and they're being published in books. And that really like blew my world wide open. And I thought,
Wow.
wow, maybe I can do this myself someday. I really enjoy it at this moment. And I didn't know what the path was at all at that point, but it really was where the seed was planted for sure.
So when did that path discover? Because I mean, I think you grew up in the Parry Sound area of Ontario, and I grew up north of Sudbury, and you're in Sudbury right now.
Mhm.
Um, and I just know that we didn't even have a writing class for my high school was so small. I had to do a correspondence class with mailing stuff to a teacher in Toronto because I wanted to
Yeah.
take grade 13 writing. I don't think there was a grade 13 by the time you were in high school, but
Oh, there still was. Yeah.
there was still a grade
Yeah.
13. Okay. Because I thought they phased it out in the 90s. But I guess the question I was going to ask is, when did you discover that you discovered, okay, Indigenous writers, there is a place. But when did you discover that this is something you could do, and how did you first start submitting stories? Because I mean, I remember typewriters and Canada Post.
Yeah. Yeah. As you mentioned, like there's no, I think, roadmap that anybody really presents to you, in high school or later on, depending on whatever post-secondary program you end up in. I was really fortunate at Perry Sound High School to have a specific grade 12 creative writing course with a teacher named Tom Bennett. And I think that's where I first was exposed to like the idea of craft, quote unquote,
Right.
whatever that means. And that really helped me like structure short stories. It helped me like map out plot and develop characters and so on. But it was a long time before that turned into like actually writing things out and submitting them and so on because I got sort of sidetracked by a whole other career in journalism, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I ended up going down to Toronto to what's now Toronto Metropolitan University for journalism
Right.
in the late 90s in 98, and I graduated in 2002 and
Okay.
started working in the field, pretty much right away. And I think journalism obviously became my main focus at that point, but I was still like dabbling in creative writing,
Right,
moonlighting,
right.
having it as my hobby in the evenings and on the weekends and so on, but still like not knowing how to do it. And I think I was really fortunate living in Toronto at the time in the early to mid 2000s, getting to know a lot of artists, writers, visual artists, musicians, and so on, people who were really tuned into I guess the whole arts sector and the grants opportunities. And I applied for my first writing grant from the Canada Council in about 2004, I think. And that's where it opened up for me. And just getting to know people and asking questions about how to submit a draft, who to send it to, and so on. It was really grassroots built for me. It was really a manner of getting to know people in the community around me and having the courage and confidence, I think, to ask them and to lean on them for advice and really get pointed in the right direction.
Wow. So 2004, I guess, was when that started. Your first was your first book, was that Midnight Sweat Lodge? Was that like that collection of short stories?
Yeah, that was my first book, and that's what I got, my first grant for was to, essentially revise the short stories I wrote back when I was a kid, high school kid on the res,
Yeah.
doing these creative writing assignments for high school, and I sort of envisioned updating some of those stories, putting them into a cohesive collection with this like threaded narrative through them. And yeah,
Very
that's what.
Canadian. Very Canadian, by the way, right? The short story, like what Stephen Leacock and Alice Munro, and I'm thinking about all of these people that we read in high school. Um,
Yeah, I honestly think that was probably the influence. I thought that's the first step you got to take because
right.
you read so many of those short stories in high school, right? And even in university too. I think that I really gravitated towards that, and that just seemed like the natural first step.
Great. So it was just so funny. I tried to get into what's now Toronto Metropolitan University, but you had to have really good grades to get in because I applied for journalism there, and they just ignored me like, "Go away, little boy." Carleton wouldn't even accept me in their journalism program, but they brought me into English. I'm like, "Well, all right, I may as well get an English degree." So
There you go.
but I had the same thought as you, like, okay, I love writing. Maybe I can write for a living with journalism. But that worked out for you, the journalism. At what point did that change for you? That journalism wasn't the forefront, but then creative writing became more of the forefront.
Things really changed for me when Moon of the Crusted Snow came out in 2018. Post-apocalyptic story about a Northern Ontario Anishinaabe community. It gradually developed, a readership, and I think the people who appreciated and were enthusiastic about the story really wanted me to pursue a sequel. And as that sort of momentum built while I was working at CBC, you know, another path sort of opened for me. And I saw the potential to, I think, write full time, as my main gig. And of course, it didn't like magically just, plop in front of me. There was a lot of planning and sort of work I had to do to make that career change. But it was in 2020 that I left my journalism job and started focusing on creative writing full time. And it's just been
Wow.
a huge blessing. Just very fortunate to have been able to have these opportunities for sure.
Cool. So you talk about 2020, and I know because I've heard you share the backstory of the inspiration for another event like 2020, at least in this part of the eastern, northeastern North America.
Yeah.
So I want to, yeah, let's dig into that first because Moon of the Crusted Snow. I remember reading it, and I remember just feeling so. I mean, it felt like an area I was familiar with because it was an
Cool.
area I was familiar with, but it was also
Beautiful.
about something I was not as familiar with. Like growing up on a reservation and the indigenous communities and stuff like that, that I was always adjacent to, but never
Mhm.
really had insights to. So tell us about Moon of the Crusted Snow, because I think it's an amazing novel, and all my listeners should go out and buy the book or get it from their local library or however they can get their hands on it. Amazing
Oh.
novel, and then they can enjoy the sequel. But let's talk about that because I love the inspiration you share about what kind of inspired you to come up with this.
Yeah, well, thanks a lot for those kind words, Mark. It means a lot that you love the story. I'm honored to hear that from you. The main, I think, event that inspired the story was an actual blackout. Was come to be known as the Northeast Blackout of 2003. I was living in Toronto at the time, working as a freelance journalist, and the day the blackout happened, I was actually back home in Wasauksing near Parry Sound, where I grew up, house sitting for my dad and stepmom who were on summer holidays. I was there with my two younger brothers, and the power went out on this like sunny, calm afternoon in mid-August, and we're like, that's kind of weird, Power usually goes out when there's high winds or storm, whatever, right? So we just noted it at first and then, didn't think too much of it until we got bored, right? Until we couldn't turn the Xbox back on or, watch a movie or anything. And we thought, well, let's drive into town. Parry Sound's a 10-minute drive away. Let's go see what's happening there because we need something to do. And we got there and we saw that the power was out there too. And we thought, wow, this must be a bigger deal if the power's out in town along with the res. And we were driving along the main street, pulled over, saw some friends of ours that we knew, and one of them had heard on the radio that it was this huge blackout. That all these big cities like Toronto, Ottawa, Boston, Cleveland, New York, Detroit, we're all in the dark. Nobody knew why. Nobody knew when the power was going to come back on. And it was just this big cloud of mystery over the whole event. So right away, my brothers and I thought it was the end of the world. We're like, this is it. It's hitting the fan right now. Let's get ready for chaos, right? So we got back in the car and drove back to the res and started right away making a survival plan. We're like, this is gonna be our new future. This blackout's like causing the end of the world, and we got to adjust. We got to figure it out. So we did all these things when we got back to our dad's place, like, made an inventory of all the food. We gathered firewood from the backyard because we're like, this is how we're gonna have to cook now. And just did all these preparations for survival. So the day went on, and we're thinking about, and the power was still out. It was still totally dark at nighttime, and we're talking about what we're going to do the next day. And we're like, well, let's do another round of check-ins, because we, checked in on our grandmother and some aunts and uncles and so on. And then let's go fishing because like that's all we're going to be eating from now on is
Yeah,
fish,
yeah.
So yeah, and as we thought about that though, we're like, holy geez, this is the best place to be for the end of the world because we can get our food from the bush. We have resourceful people around us who know how to make medicine from the bush. Like if we run out of Tylenol, our auntie knows how to get bark off that tree over there to make pain relief medicine, or use sumac berries to make pain relief medicine. And we thought, this community isn't that far removed from, the days of no hydro anyway. So let's just hang out here until the chaos subsides, right? And it was a pretty cool like revelation that we had because when you grow up on the res, especially back in the 80s and 90s, there are all kinds of stereotypes, all kinds of mythologies that you got to deal with about who you are as an Indigenous person, how the rest of society sees you, sees the res, etc. And the general stereotype is like the res is this dangerous place of violence and despair, whereas, it's the opposite in many examples, right? So at that point, I had left to go to Toronto to go to school and start my career. And then coming back for that moment was like so enriching and so fulfilling and just heartwarming to be reminded of the talents and the beauty and just the resourcefulness of the place and how it's a safe haven at the end of the world, which we thought it was, right? So just that sort of mental shift for me back to my upbringing and my roots really inspired me to think about how I want to portray that perspective of the res somehow, some way, right? And back
Right,
then I
right.
was 24. I wasn't an author yet, but I sort of just planted that seed in there and just sort of let it gestate. And that's really the moment that started Moon of the Crusted Snow, essentially.
I love that. You were, had you been in Toronto, it would have been a completely different experience because I was working in downtown Toronto when the power went out, and
Mhm.
it was a bit more chaotic. I think, and one of the things, and I think this is one of the defining things in the community in your novel, is there is a sense of community. There is a
Mhm.
sense of coming together. There's also an existing sense of isolation because they don't know what's
Mhm.
happened down
Mhm.
south. They don't know that the big city, Toronto, is in chaos
Mhm.
because the power's gone, and that's kind of the. I mean, like you said, you could go fishing, you could go hunting, you had access to firewood. Where do you get stuff like that when you live in a city?
Yeah.
So, let's talk a little bit about that aspect of the novel. So the premise obviously is the power goes out. We don't know why. It doesn't matter, actually. You explain
Mhm.
it in book two, but it doesn't
Mhm.
really matter. It's just gone. Deal with it.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that geography was a really important part of the development of the plot. And I think solidifying that setting too.
Yeah,
And I really love how you said it felt familiar to you because, that's exactly what I was going for. Like, even though it's a reserve, you don't have to be from a reserve to understand what the story is or what the stakes are, right?
yeah,
But that there's that familiarity for someone like you who's, from the north. Yeah, that's super cool. And I think that's what, I was trying to do as a writer is just like provide this moment, this flash of this experience that some people may remember, show what the stakes for survival are, and express, the heartfelt spirit of community that has withstood a lot of violence historically and is able to help these people through this particular moment, yet another moment of catastrophe in their history, you know?
yeah,
Um, going back to like the gestation of the idea, when I first thought about writing the story, I thought, okay, I want to write about a community like mine, in central Ontario on Georgian Bay, beside a town, only a couple hours north of Toronto. But it didn't feel like the same kind of vibe I wanted the more I let that sit in my mind, because in reality, if that blackout actually was the end of the world and chaos ensued, the story would be over much faster than the actual story I wrote
right,
because of that proximity to urban Canada, right?
right, yeah,
So in that sense, I made the decision to place it in far northern Ontario, have that separation from the South and from the urban core, and just show like what that socioeconomic, political divide can be between Indigenous communities in the North and the cities to the South, but also highlight the strengths of being able to be in the bush and that resilience for survival as a result of those time-honored skills, you know?
yeah, yeah.
So yeah, that was beyond the decision to place it from like the Great Lakes to way up north, and to me, like it helped me really dive into some of those issues, those themes, et cetera, et cetera. And I think it provided a different pacing to the story that I also had to learn how to work on,
Yeah.
and so on. And as a writer, pacing is almost everything, especially when we're working in specific genres,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So that was a really fun learning experience for me too.
Wow, wow. I'm going to want to get into some of the mechanics and logistics of the publishers and stuff because the second book was published by a different publisher. We won't get into that yet. I want to get into the plot because in the first book, the community is stays in a particular spot, and I mean, snow machines are one of the only ways you can get there in the winter, which is very familiar from where I grew up north of Sudbury, because that's how we got around in the winter time. That was just how we got around because there was winter way more often than there is now in terms of snow. But in the second book, there's the moving. So you address another theme or another issue of having to move.
Mhm.
And can you talk a little bit about so this is Moon of the Turning Leaves, which is 2018 was Moon of the Crusted Snow, and Moon of the Turning Leaves just came out in 2024, didn't it? Or 20 late 2023? I'm trying.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Mhm. Yeah, like when I was presented with the idea of writing a sequel, I thought long and hard about the kind of story I wanted to write. Immediately, what I didn't want to do was, here's what happened the next day kind of thing, right? Like, I didn't want to pick up right after the end of the first book because it would have been similar in atmosphere, similar in stakes, the exact same characters.
Yeah.
And I just didn't know what the point of that story could be, other than showing an extension of the first book. So I thought, what would be a fun sequel for me to write, like selfishly, It was like putting it farther into the future, being a little more speculative, thinking about how the world would change 12 years after a world-ending blackout, and how this community could evolve and adapt on its own, yet at the same time still be faced with more potential consequences of not only the blackout, but their choices to live in the way that they do in response to it, and so on, right? So yeah, the first book is self-contained. The action comes to them. They have to make their decisions as a result of, these invaders. Some helpful, some not so helpful. And then in the second book, they've been able to like liberate themselves because of this blackout and, live more autonomously as Anishinaabe people in Northern Ontario. But they're also like at the whim of nature itself, and they're in this isolated place, depleting the resources around them, which they acknowledge early in the story isn't the Anishinaabe way. The Anishinaabe way would have been to migrate regularly, to
Right.
allow the land to replenish itself, to, create different settlements at different parts of the land, according to season, according to food supply, and so on. So they have this, realization early on. And they also, recognize that they haven't really explored too much around them in the aftermath of the blackout. So they should try to put some answers together as to what has happened in
Right.
the rest of the world. And a bigger part of that is it's explained in the first book that, they've been displaced from the Great Lakes to far northern Ontario. And in the second book, they, acknowledge that history and think, well, maybe this is our opportunity to have this mass exodus down south back to the Great Lakes, to sort of reclaim our homeland, right?
Right.
So it becomes a story of movement for sure. And they go on this quest over the course of, a summer to see what's left of the world, if in fact it has ended, to seek other communities and to address the viability of being able to return to the Great Lakes and, all the dangers and sort of natural pitfalls that they encounter along the way. So it was exciting to, I think, infuse that idea of mobility into it and just movement in general. And I think a rediscovery of the natural world around them after all those years of isolation, right?
Right.
And yeah, just the think about the people that they could encounter in the aftermath of the apocalypse and how society would reform was really exciting to do too.
Yeah. Well, I have to tell you, I am waiting for season one and season two of either CBC or someone, Netflix, someone to pick up Apple maybe to pick up the rights to make this because I think it would just be truly amazing.
Oh,
Uh, so let's talk about getting that first novel published in 2018. Now, ECW Press, a fantastic press out of Toronto.
yeah.
How did that happen? Did you go through an agent? Was it submission straight to the publisher? How did that work?
Yeah, it was straight to the publisher. It was a really interesting, I think, path. I had been working at CBC, and I was contacted by Susan Renouf, who was an acquiring editor at ECW at the time. And she asked me if I'd be interested in writing some sort of nonfiction book for ECW,
Right.
related to, and this is like in the aftermath of the TRC, right? There was a huge spotlight on Indigenous issues and communities. And as a journalist, I'd done a lot of work on these modern, I guess, or contemporary issues and changes and so on, right?
Yeah.
So our first discussions were about writing something nonfiction. And we batted these ideas back and forth, but things were moving so quickly back then, like in 2015 and beyond, that it was really hard to focus on one particular topic because of that constant evolution of awareness and so on, right?
Right.
So we eventually just said, well, I guess it's not going to work out, and she said, well, do you have anything else that you're working on? And I'd been working on Moon of the Crusted Snow just in my spare time. It was, something that I was having fun doing, writing this post-apocalyptic story set on the res. And so I said to her, if you're interested in fiction, I've got this manuscript, just saved on my laptop, right? And she said, "Well, let me take a look at it." And she did take a look at it, and it needed a lot of work for sure at that point editorially, but she was interested, and yeah, she offered me a contract not long after, and that's pretty much how it began, really.
Cool, cool. I love that. I'm curious about how it worked because I learned a lot of different phrases and terminology, Anishinaabe as well from the book. How much, I mean, how much when you're working with an editor who's not familiar with that, how did that work out?
Oh, I'm glad you asked that because it was such a wonderful experience working with Susan about all that, on all that specifically.
Right,
I had this draft of the story. And my first attempt at writing something in the spec fiction genre, having only been a fan since, being a kid and just really taking my first stab at it, but
right,
trying also to be as authentically Anishinaabe as possible. It's an
right.
Anishinaabe
Yeah,
story and in this genre, and the Anishinaabe elements are what are the most crucial to me, right? As the storyteller, as the writer. And I really wanted to do all that respectfully. I wanted to do it honestly, and I wanted to obviously stand by all of that, and advocate for all of those things that are in it, including the language. And she was entirely hands off about all of that, and it was really, I think, empowering for me. It was my first time working with a non-Indigenous publisher. So it was really empowering to know that I had like allyship within this publisher, within the industry, because
right.
you don't know, right? When you're coming into it as someone from the so-called margins, who's on your side and who isn't,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
and Susan was entirely on my side. And I think specifically with the language, with Anishinaabe, you know, like I look back at like the first draft after the fact, and it's so funny because like I wrote the Anishinaabe passages, which pretty much all come up in dialogue. The character speaks in the language in Anishinaabe and then repeats themselves in English right after, all in the first draft. This is how I wrote it all, right?
yeah,
So she flagged that right away and she said, why did you write it like that? And I was like, well, I don't know. I felt like I had to translate it somehow for people like who don't know it. And she said, well, it's kind of silly to see it that way because a real speaker speaking to someone else who understands the language wouldn't repeat the same thing in English as they're talking to them, right?
right, right.
It's
Yeah,
redundant and just totally unnatural. And I said, yeah, you're right. It is silly. She didn't say silly. That's my words. I think it's
yeah,
silly. And she said there's other ways you can translate it, either through the context of the scene, through the action of the characters, through the dialogue of the English dialogue of the other characters and conversation, et cetera, et cetera. She said also you don't have to translate it if you don't want to. Like let your language stand proudly on its own in
yes,
this English text. And yeah, it was just so amazing, to have a white woman in her 60s in Toronto, telling me these things about my res experiences and
yeah.
the res elements that I wanted to stand in the story. And yeah, it was just amazing. And that really, I think, has empowered me to stick by that to this day.
Well, I love that. This is not the first time I've heard you praise Susan as a great editor that you enjoyed working with. I've heard you talk about her at different talks and panels over the
Yeah.
years. But that does stick out so beautifully. It because I felt like within the context, I knew I didn't know, but I learned, and it was a great experience as well. So kudos to both of you for working in that wonderfully collaborative way. So
Oh, thanks, Mark. Right on.
So that was a huge success. I mean, it was. I mean, it was lauded. It was praised. It's done really, really well. Put you on the map, so to speak. And then the sequel. How did the you were talked into a sequel, or and again you decided, okay, I'm going to set this 12 years in the future. Actually, before I get there, I just have to comment. Speculative fiction. This is speculative fiction. I put you in the same wheelhouse as Margaret Atwood, not just for your quality of writing, but also
Oh.
because this is people who don't read science fiction and fantasy or speculative fiction will read your novel and go, "No, it's not science fiction, it's not speculative fiction, it's good."
Mhm.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I think it's interesting because me reading across the genres, I go all the way, way out there, not just mildly speculative of a of a potential near future.
Mhm.
Um, so that's the first observation. So you've been able to bridge that gap beautifully. I mean, you and I were
Oh,
just
thank
recently at a speculative fiction conference in Ottawa,
Yeah.
but you're also equally comfortable on stage with literary people as well. So you've got this great, I call it the Margaret Atwoodization, where people who read science fiction and literature can enjoy your stuff.
Oh man, thanks for mentioning that. And I will just say like that has just been one of the biggest gifts of having Moon of the Crescent Snow out there is being welcomed into the SFF community, which is something I didn't anticipate whatsoever, you know.
Yeah, yeah,
And being at CanCon, hanging out with you, hanging out with our peers, just like wow, you know, like it feels like validation in some ways, but it's not also like there's a meritocracy or a hierarchy there because everyone's just so humble and cool and community focused, right?
right.
So yeah, that's been just one of the best parts of this whole journey is yeah, being a part of the community for sure.
Awesome, awesome. So with the second book, you didn't go with this amazing, awesome publisher. And we were talking before the before the interview started. We were talking a little bit about that sometimes it's just the realities of whatever the bank book or
Yeah,
whatever.
yeah.
So there's no
Yeah,
hard feelings, right? But it was just sort of a business decision that had to be made.
yeah, entirely a business decision. As mentioned many times, I never intended on writing a sequel. I was persuaded to, mostly by readers, so readers get all the credit for pushing me in that direction. But when, those wheels were really starting to turn, I had partnered with an agent by that point, right?
Right.
So after the fact, my agent Denise Bukowski, she's like, "Hey, notice your books out there. Do you have representation?" And I said, "No, actually, I don't." She said, "Really? Want to come on board?" And I said, "Yeah, for sure." And she said, "Our first order of business will be trying to get a sequel," because she had heard in the industry that there was, interest in a potential sequel to the story. So this was, I think, in the summer of 2019 when I guess the wheels started moving. And she said, come up with your pitch and, I'll find you a meeting and hopefully it'll all come together. So, I had the basic premise of 12 years after the blackout and
Right.
this quest story. And I went down to Toronto that fall for a Tool concert to go see Tool with a bunch of my buddies. And had the afternoon free, and I mentioned it to her that I'd be around, and she said, "Okay, I'll get you this meeting with some people I know." And it was Rick Meyer, who would become the editor of Moon of the Turning Leaves, and Collins, both with Penguin Random House. And she said, "Just pitch to them what your idea is, and we'll see what happens, right?" So they were interested, and what I had to do after that was talk to Rick on a regular basis to, I guess, bring him up to speed as to how the story was developing for me and where I saw it going and so on. So we would have these monthly check-ins about, a sequel. And then finally, when he was satisfied that there was enough there, that's when they offered me a contract, right? And of course, this was all unbeknownst to ECW, but it wasn't like I was, sneaking around,
Yeah.
behind your back or anything like that. But the potential to publish with them came with, a decent size advance that would let me take, diversion from my journalism work and then spend enough time to write the sequel, right? And
Right.
and when I went back to ECW and said, Penguin Random House has offered me this contract to write the sequel, they said, straight up, that's great. We can't match that. Advance, have at it. All the best kind of thing. And I've maintained a really good relationship with ECW since,
Of course. Yeah.
we're in touch about, the ongoing attention that Moon of the Crusted Snow gets, and I wholeheartedly support them and all their catalog and all their people internally because they're all wonderful. And yeah, I think it's an ongoing partnership that we all work with, right? In terms of
Yeah.
having these two stories out there that are part of the same package,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
I hope to serve as like a common thread between these two publishers somehow,
Yeah.
and advocate for both of them, obviously.
Yeah.
The bigger one maybe doesn't necessarily need my advocacy or my voice, but yeah, that's basically what it all came down to is
Right.
when Rick was satisfied that there's enough for a sequel, he said, okay, here's what a contract would look like, and here's the advance that we would offer you.
Yeah.
And for me, the writing was on the wall that this is my only real shot at this,
Yeah.
to make a living as a full-time author, to leave my journalism job. And obviously, I had many discussions with my wife around all this, and
Yes.
we sort of lined everything up to make that transition. And fortunately, it worked. And it's been almost 5 years now since I made that leap.
Wow.
But yeah, it's just, interesting how the industry works, right? Like, as you know, there are so many different paths to getting published, so many different things to navigate. But what I've learned after all these years is the relationships that you form and the commitments that you make are really crucial, and you
Yeah.
have to uphold them in a good way. And you have to be a good community member, a good partner, and maintain all bridges in all directions because you just never know where things are going to go, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I love the fact that you've got this two book series or this two book collection,
Mhm.
and you've got two different publishers. One that's actually very Canadian, and the other one that's Canadian but also international as well. So
Yeah,
you've got the best of, I mean, the best of both worlds in there. You've got like a smaller, I was not like boutique publisher, but a publisher where there's not as many levels and layers of you have to check with somebody in another country to confirm. And I know there's a lot of autonomy in the Canadian divisions of Penguin Random House, but still, it's a different thing.
yeah,
Whereas yeah, Susan just goes to David at ECW and gets an answer that afternoon, right?
exactly. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and that's the thing too, I had pitched I had pitched like a really loose query of Moon of the Crested Snow when it was just sort of sitting on my digital shelf to
Right.
a bigger publisher, and it was entirely brushed off, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But it takes like a publisher like ECW to take a chance on a story that
Yeah,
maybe other publishers would not be familiar with,
right.
and like they gave it a home and changed my life essentially, right? So I'll
Yeah,
always give them a shout out no matter what.
for sure. And I love both those publishers and I love both of those novels. But you're working on something new. Let's can we dig into what you're working on now? Well, give us a little teaser.
Yeah, for sure. It's a diversion from this sort of post-apocalyptic
Yeah.
saga. Kind of need a break from it.
Yes.
It's a very basic story about a day in the life of a reserve in central Ontario, a couple weeks before Christmas, with a big bingo jackpot happening that evening, and just the various shenanigans that can happen around bingo on the res.
Really?
Growing up on the res, bingo is a big thing,
Yeah.
obviously, and I think what I want to do beyond just a story about bingo is like offer the humanity and the day-to-day silliness that can occur on the res, and my
Yeah.
intention is to make this a comedy,
Really?
which is
Okay.
hugely scary for me because
Right.
I am I guess a little self-conscious of how funny maybe I am, or whether I have the skills to be funny, so it's a bit of an ambitious jaunt, but I'm having fun doing it. And Random House will publish it. They're aiming for the end of 2026 if
Okay.
everything goes according to plan, but we'll see.
Oh,
But
well.
then, I definitely will get back to the moon. We're calling it the White Sky Saga in general,
Yeah.
just for uniformity. I will get back to that someday.
Oh, really?
And yeah,
Oh,
yeah, I have like a few ideas for other books in the series. Whether all of those or none of those work out, we'll see. But
Hmm.
yeah, definitely gonna get back to it because like they're the stories that changed my life, and
Yeah.
I feel like I owe it to the readers, obviously, but also to the world that, I've been fortunate to imagine and the characters within it to try again in the future.
Well, I would love to return to that world as well, but also just to get into any of your writing. So I can't help but think of when you talk about bingo and you talk about the res and I'm remembering reading Thompson Highway's The Res Sisters.
Yeah.
Manitoulin Island was where that was set, closer to where I'm from north of, or just outside of Sudbury. But because that was when I learned how popular bingo was.
Yeah.
Did you ever see the stage play version of that? Or
I have. The Bajima Jake Theater Group that's based on Manitoulin Island, they brought a production of it to Wasauksing back in the late 80s. So I remember being a kid and watching it in our community hall.
okay, all right,
Yeah, being performed. And yeah, like core memory for sure, seeing
yeah.
something like that. And I recently reread it as I was doing research for this book.
Yeah,
So
because I imagine there's going to be a lot of people like, ooh, it's like
yeah,
if you like the Red Sisters, you're going to love.
exactly.
Right? So,
Hopefully, yeah, holy geez, it would just be an honor to be in the same conversation. Absolutely.
oh, awesome, awesome. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today. Before we go, just a few last questions. The second last question is. For any writers who are listening who are, they're sitting on the manuscript or they're working on the manuscript while they're doing their journalism or day job or whatever it is, what advice would you give to aspiring writers out there?
Oh, like just stick to it. Like enjoy the process. Remind yourself that you're creating something that will hopefully be read by others and give them joy. But most importantly, make sure you derive joy from the whole process. That it's a story, you believe in and that you want to write. And that the fact that you're engaged in the process totally validates it, in my opinion. Everybody can be a writer, in my opinion, right? And it's just ensuring that you carry the passion and the love for it with you at all times and ensuring that you can devote that positive energy to creating something that you love too. So the journey is long, the journey is varied. There's as we talked early on in the conversation, there's no one direct path to becoming a published author, right? There's so many different ways you can take. But just believe in your story and believe in yourself and you'll get there.
Awesome. Thank you for that. And final question is, where can my listeners find more of you online?
Yeah, I am on Facebook. You can find me there at Waubgeshig Rice. On Twitter or X now at Waub at WAUB. I'm also on Blue Sky, which I'm spending more time on. Find me there at Waub too, and on Instagram at Waub at WAUB. And my website's just waub.ca, waub.ca.
Awesome. And I will have links to all that in the show notes. Thank you again so much for hanging out with me today.
Oh, Mark, this has been so fun. Thanks for having me. It's just an honor to spend time with you again.